Frigid winds and heavy snowfall are expected each winter in Grand Forks, North Dakota. It's just part of life on the Great Plains. But during the final months of 1996, it was becoming apparent that this winter was anything but ordinary. The first blizzard struck early, on November 17th, and in the course of the next 6 months, 7 more hit the region, each time bringing life in the city of Grand Forks and at the University of North Dakota to a standstill. At its worst, the winter produced wind chill factors that were recorded at 90 degrees below zero. The winds eventually died down each time, but with each blizzard came more snowfall. In all, Grand Forks received a record 98.6 inches of snow, and people began talking about the threat of severe flooding. But no amount of speculation could have prepared Grand Forks for what was to come. Even before the Red River began to rise, thousands of volunteers started filling and laying sandbags. People of all ages and from all walks of life worked side by side, trying to prepare the city for what was expected to be the flood of the century. The National Weather Service predicted a 49-foot crest for Grand Forks, a level higher than a flood that hit the city in 1979. Emergency officials scrambled to raise the dikes to 52 feet. As the river rose, the battle intensified. Schools let students out to sandbag. Businesses shut down so its employees could volunteer. And North Dakota's Governor Ed Schaefer brought in the National Guard to help with the flood fighting effort. At the University of North Dakota, students, staff, and faculty fought together to hold back the water, spending countless hours laying sandbags near threatened areas. On April 16th, the Red River rose past the 1979 crest, and the National Weather Service quickly changed its prediction to 50.5 feet. The next day, the river approached 51 feet, and the National Weather Service raised its prediction another foot. The city scrambled to make its dikes even higher, but on April 18th, it became painfully clear that the Red River could not be held back. Boils began to appear in some of the dikes, and residents that had spent weeks trying to save their homes were told to leave. By the end of the day, hundreds of homes in the low-lying areas of Grand Forks had water up to the rooftops. The only remaining bridge open between Grand Forks and East Grand Forks was closed. Emergency operations were moved from the basement of the Grand Forks Police Department, where water was coming in fast, to the University of North Dakota. On April 19th, the water was 4 feet deep in downtown Grand Forks. All of East Grand Forks was flooded, and UND President Kendall Baker called off classes for the rest of the semester, sending all of the students home. And just when people thought things couldn't get any worse, a fire broke out in downtown Grand Forks. The blaze burned through the night, and before firefighters could put it out, 11 buildings were lost or sustained heavy damage. On April 21st, the Red River finally crested at 54.11 feet, more than 5 feet higher than previous modern-day record. By this time, nearly all of the 50,000 residents of Grand Forks and East Grand Forks had been forced to leave, turning the two cities into a watery ghost town. In sharp contrast to the silent streets of Grand Forks was the flurry of activity going on at the University of North Dakota. With emergency operations for Grand Forks housed at Plant Services, UND became a clearinghouse for information vital in helping residents deal with the flood disaster. The successful move of emergency operations from its flooded downtown headquarters happened in large part because of the work of UND personnel.
Plant Services become a real important entity to this whole process. There was some talk of the EOC Center downtown and what was going to happen with the EOC Center. Never in our dreams would we ever think that the EOC Center would be relocated. I just was a total awe as to what was going on. And within a few hours, we had them all wired up.
We're looking for our nurses and our healthcare providers, especially our nurses.
One local radio station, whose downtown headquarters were surrounded by water, even made its broadcasts from UND. And while Grand Forks officials dealt with a city-wide crisis, UND administrators and staff worked at saving what they could of their campus. To accomplish that task, a plan of action was formulated each morning during the flood. At these strategy sessions, led by President Ken Baker, UND personnel decided what needed to be done each day. At times, the decisions did not come easily.
The first meeting that we had where the president said, I will never forget these words, which jewels of the university are we going to save, and what are they? Let's make a list. Here's 14 people in this room. And it's like, okay, here we are, and we made a list.
When it became clear that much of the campus could be inundated, efforts shifted from keeping the water out to keeping the damage to a minimum. Plant Services personnel cut the power to as many threatened buildings as they could, trying to prevent a fire hazard. The goal was to shut the campus down in a way that would save as much as possible when it was brought back up again. As it turned out, the fears of UND officials were well-founded. Despite extreme efforts to keep all the facilities on campus dry, floodwaters eventually made their way into several buildings.
It was like we were surrounded, sort of, and we were fighting diligently to try to keep the water out of those environments, but there came a point where we just sort of said, it keeps coming up and we just can't do it.
We really weren't prepared for what was to come. And when we were working and trying to save every facility that we had, we were doing very well up to a point when the lift stations went down. That was really the hardest thing I think that I had to do is when we started to get into those kind of issues, and Leroy would say, well, let that go. Let Smith fill up. Let Princeton Trailer Court go. Let it fill up. Let Wilkerson fill up.
One of the buildings on campus hit hardest by the flood was the medical school. Here, several feet of water damaged nearly everything on the ground floor.
When you see the water in there and you start walking through it and it's chest deep, and you see desks and you see chairs and you see books and you see all that floating in the water. And then you start to realize what kind of a problem we have.
Okay, this is something else. You got to get to see a picture of this.
Another building that took on water damage was the federally owned Human Nutrition Research Center, located near the campus. Unknown to Plant Services personnel, the center was one of the few flooded buildings that still had power, a fact they soon discovered as they waded through the hallways.
Yes, we got smoke. We got smoke. Let's get out. Lucky we went in. That's all I got to say. We don't need a fire. No. But let's go get out. Diane, what's happening with that fire truck? Okay, we got to talk them through it. There's volatile chemicals in here, and there's a real dangerous situation in the electrical room, so we need to talk them through it. Can they patch us in?
Quick action prevented any further damage from the fire. But the destruction caused by the flood itself became even more apparent after the waters receded. What once were classrooms and research labs were barely recognizable. Water-soaked debris was scattered everywhere, and a layer of mud covered the walls. At the same time, employees at UND Plant Services were facing a huge cleanup effort on campus. Many of them were trying to cope with the damage to their own homes. And for some, that was a hard thing to do.
Oh, it hurts. It hurts a lot. You know, you got a lifetime of watching your kids grow and things like that, and you see them, and they haven't been back in this house since the day we left and got evacuated, and I won't let them back into this because it's totally disgusting.
David Jensen, the business manager for UND Plant Services, lived in one of the worst-hit neighborhoods in Grand Forks. When the river was at its highest, only the rooftop of Jensen's home was still visible. When Jensen was able to return to his home after the flood, there was little left to come back to.
This is what's left of my living room. The walls are falling in and sinking and caving in, whatever. The ceiling's falling down. It's cracked. There's my boy. I'm gonna have to try to save that picture if I can. There's all my bills and things like that. Pens, papers.
Like hundreds of other flood-damaged houses, Jensen's home had to be torn down. For most everyone else, the task at hand was to clean out their main floors or basements, anywhere the floodwaters touched. At UND, Plant Services employees were hard at work doing the same, washing up the grime and filth that was left behind by the floodwaters. But they knew what might look clean to the naked eye may still pose a health hazard from mold growth. Without power, the buildings on campus were dark, damp, and poorly ventilated for weeks, creating prime breeding ground for mold. Plant Services hired an industrial hygienist to train its people on how to properly deal with the problem. Crews tore out sheetrock and other water-damaged material, trying to get rid of anything mold might feed on. 72 of UND's buildings, amounting to more than 500,000 square feet of floor space, were damaged from the flood, and workers had to meticulously clean out and disinfect each one. The most common type of mold found on campus was penicillium, which when found in high concentrations can make people sick. But the hygienists also discovered a type of mold called Stachybotrys, which can be deadly. For that reason, crews took every precaution, wearing protective clothing and respirators as they searched and disinfected the buildings. At times, the fight to control the mold became very frustrating. Since it only takes one spore to allow the mold to spread, inspectors found mold in rooms with no water damage at all, carried there through the air or by hitching a ride on someone's shoe. In other cases, the mold crept up asbestos-covered pipes from one floor to the next. Some mold was even found in buildings that were completely dry inside during the flood. To save the buildings, workers had to spray disinfectant every day for a month. Because of their determination, only 2 of the 72 buildings had to be torn down because of mold contamination. Another headache for Plant Services was asbestos removal. Dozens of flood-damaged buildings on campus used pipe insulation and floor tile made of asbestos. Because of the potential health risk, UND hired a contractor specially equipped to remove it safely. But it wasn't just above ground where UND Plant Services ran into problems. Floodwaters also heavily damaged much of the 69 miles of underground steam, water, electrical, telecommunications, and storm and sewer systems. Problems arose when water invaded the intricate network of tunnels located underneath much of UND. Crews spent weeks pumping out the tunnels and drying and repairing the broken lines. Much of the work was given to outside contractors who brought in hundreds of extra workers to help out the Plant Services staff. Despite the numerous obstacles they faced, Plant Services personnel met a huge challenge by getting the campus ready to hold summer session. A remarkable accomplishment, considering the session began just 1 month after floodwaters inundated much of the campus. And by the time the fall semester started, returning students noticed few effects from the flood. Buildings once devastated by high water now show little evidence that they had ever been damaged at all. The medical school building, which had several feet of water on the ground floor, has been repaired and is once again the center of learning for medical and health science students. The basement of the Memorial Union, which was a recreational and food service center before water ruined all the furnishings and equipment, is once again a popular place for students to take a break from their studies. Miles of underground tunnels, once covered with mud from top to bottom, have been cleaned and are again protecting students from the elements as they make their way across campus. And dining facilities that were filthy enough to cause even the hungriest of students to lose their appetites have been restored and are now being used to feed thousands of students every day. For the University of North Dakota staff and students, the flood of '97 brought with it struggles, frustrations, and challenges. The battle to protect the campus, the feeling of defeat when much of it went under, and the monumental task of picking up the pieces afterwards. But UND has rebounded and is continuing to provide the quality education students have come to expect. Playing an important role in the restoration process has been the work of Plant Services personnel, who for a time were forced to surrender much of the campus to the Red River, but are now showing that determination, dedication, and hard work are things even Mother Nature cannot defeat.